Alright guys, in this video I want to go over how to determine your ideal training block length as a powerlifter. And this is something that I think is important to understand because it's really going to allow you to maximize your strength in the long run, because training blocks are going to be, like, the overall length is going to basically correlate with a few things, like how long it takes for the lifter to drop fatigue, how long it takes for them to adapt to the new training stimulus of the training block, and then it's going to be, if the lifter generally responds better to bigger or smaller jumps as they are building strength throughout the training block. So those are like the three main things that I do consider when I am, asking myself this question for a lifter. And usually lifters are going to fall into a 3-week, a 4-week, or a 5-week block length. I've never once programmed a 6-week block. I've heard of that happening, but usually that's how long it's going to be for most lifters. So without further ado, I want to delve right into it. So main things I'm going to be looking at for a lifter who needs a 3-week block or responds well to a 3-week block length is that they're going to recover very, very quickly from peak intensities. So what that means is that after they hit, a heavy RPE 8-9 top set on their last week of training, they can basically recover within 1 week of just very, very light training, and they are good to go and ramp up a little bit faster and hit heavier weights. They're going to set themselves up for PRing at the end of a block. This also relates to them adapting very, very fast to the new training stimulus. So usually block to block, we're going to be making some changes to the reps being used on the top set on primary days. Maybe there's changes to back homework on the primary day, as well as the secondary day. There's slight differences in intensity, and that does take time for people to adapt to, but some people just respond very, very quickly. And one key principle that we need to understand is that adaptation precedes our ability to overload. So we need to make sure that we are adapting to the current training stimulus before we try to overload the current training stimulus. And usually those lifters just feel really, really great, feel really, 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 really fresh. They're able to make a pretty big jump into their week 2 and feel very, very strong for their week 3. And that also just goes into the last point about how these lifters will typically respond better to bigger weekly weight jumps. So usually they're going to still need to lower down weight a good amount in order to drop down fatigue, but they can make a really big jump in from week 1 to week 2 to hit what's called the anchor point for week 3, which is basically the amount of load that they need to hit in order to feel strong for their final week of training to set up a PR without overly fatiguing themselves. And they can make a big jump to their week 3 and kind of repeat that. Most of the time I'm going to be seeing lifters that might respond better to this, or lifters that are, much stronger, that are usually going to be a little bit, maybe they're a little bit more well leveraged to lifts, and they're better able to adapt to training stimulus. However, because most lifters are not going to be, really well leveraged on all 3 lifts very, very well, most of the time I don't find very many people are falling into the 3-week block category, but this is something that you might want to consider. Like, I had a period of time where I was playing around with a 3-week block length, and it worked out pretty well, honestly. I just felt like I was never truly able to drop down on fatigue enough, because I had always had to ramp up my training intensity a little bit faster than my body was actually able to optimally adapt to. So it's just a slightly lower peak. Now for a 4-week block, this is probably going to be the most common one that I'm giving to probably about 80% of my training, or my lifters I've worked with. We do 4-week blocks. Not only is it a convenient unit of time, it's just typically it allows for lifter to recover a little bit slower. Most people will typically need about 2 weeks to really recover and then adapt to training. Usually what happens is that on week 1, lifters will feel pretty strong because they just came off of a heavy week of training, and their fitness is high, their ability to lift heavy weights is high. However, they're going to feel pretty beat up from that, and so they're going to feel like crap, but they'll be strong. And then week 2, they will feel less fatigued, but because they didn't go very heavy, they'll usually will feel kind of detrained, and they need a little bit of that heavier weight to feel strong, and then go into their week 3 and set themselves up for a week 4 using that similar anchor points. But usually it's going to take about 2 weeks for them to sort of notice that process happens. Whereas the 3-week block lifter typically is they kind of feel pretty good. They don't really feel like the weight's heavy on their back or in their hands, and they're going from week 1 to week 2. They can just kind of go. They just feel strong really, really fast. And then that also correlates to the lifter on the 4-week block usually it's going to respond or adapt moderately fast to new training stimulus. So usually about 2 weeks for their adaptation to really start to kick in, where the weight does not feel heavy on their back or in their hands, and then they can go, like I said, to their week 3, hit that anchor point, and PR on week 4. And then usually this also correlates to, usually there's slightly smaller weight jumps week 1 through 2. So I would classify this as like, anywhere between 2 to 4% weekly weight jumps week 1 through week 2, but then with a bigger weight jump week 3 through week 4. So usually the bigger weight jump would be like, 5 to 7% load is what I would usually find that my limit lifters would start off a block with. And usually, in like a 3-week block and 4-week block, usually you're going to be starting off anywhere between 80 to 85% of what your planned target goal weight is. And then you're going to ramp up accordingly. Usually 3-week block lifters will take, way bigger jumps, 7-10% jumps. The average jump for a week 4 lift or a 4-week block lifter would be anywhere between 4 to 7% week, and then a 5-week block, which we're going to get into, usually 3 to 5% in general throughout the block. Obviously, there's going to be some discrepancies with how big of a jump they're going to be taking from their anchor point, which again, like I mentioned, is that minimum weight they need to take on the final second to last week of training in order for them to feel strong going into their final week of training. But yeah, again, this is going to be the most common block length. It's going to be 4 weeks long. Really good middle of the road block to start off with. Now, a 5-week block, lifters tend to recover slower and they tend to adapt slower. And so this is like, you guys can see a theme here that like block length in my paradigm and what I look at is like they just recover slower, they adapt slower. And again, I'm trying to make sure that they recover before they actually adapt to the stimulus before we actually try to overload later on in the block. And so usually, they're going to have much smaller weight jumps, 2 to 4% weeks 1 through 3, then with a much bigger weight jump going into, weeks 4 to 5. Again, most of the time lifters are going, when they're talking about pacing for progression, are going to usually have a bigger jump on their going into their last week of training. They had their final week of training, just because usually there's going to be a pretty decent amount of adaptation going on in that last week. But overall, like I gave you the overall general theme. Like 3-week blocks are generally going to adapt very, very fast to training, recover very, very fast to training. They usually respond very well to really, really big jumps. Usually they're going to be, really, really strong lifters that can adapt really, 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 really fast. Usually 4-week block is going to be more middle of the road with all that. They need about 2 weeks to recover, but they can ramp up into higher intensities just fine after those 2 weeks. And then 5-week blocks just tend to need a little bit longer to really start to feel good, and before we can actually push again. Now, my general advice is going to be start off with a 4-week block and pay attention to your overall fatigue trends and when you feel stronger in that block. So if you notice that you feel stronger on a week 3 versus a week 4, or you drop fatigue fast and feel strong very fast, I would try a 3-week block. If you notice that your week 1 after a week 4 usually feels a little bit better, like you would actually respond pretty well to like the peak intensity, or you drop fatigue slowly, that's when I would try a 5-week block. And then if you notice that you feel strongest on week 4 and fatigue drops off after 2 lighter weeks of training, that's when I would keep a 4-week block. So I've experimented with all 3 of these different types of training blocks, and the reality is that they all work. Just experiment with things, see what you feel best and what produces the most repeatable outcomes, and what allows you to consistently hit the highest peak. That's really the most important thing, is like you need to make sure that with what you're doing in training and how you're lining up and pacing your blocks, as far as length goes, weekly weight jumps, we want to be able to set ourselves up for the highest peak so that we can really make those the biggest adaptation block to block we possibly can, while managing fatigue with how we are ramping up with training. Hopefully that makes sense. If you guys have any questions, ask down in the comments below. If you guys are interested in coaching, you guys want to get super jacked and strong while staying lean and aesthetic, click the link down below to apply for coaching. I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Peace.